SMS Goeben. Yavuz Sultan Selim, I think. Yavuz. Three names for the same ship. The Pride of Turkey. The final ship of Imperial Germany. The last battle cruiser, in terms of when she was scrapped, if not built. All of these and more. Here was a ship that saw more service away from her original home than in it. A German ship that spent almost no time in Germany. A ship that, regardless of her origin, would arguably become more Turkish than she was ever German. A ship that deserves more focus put on her for all that she missed Jutland and all the infamy that comes from that particular battle. Beginning life as SMS Goeben, the second Moltke-class battlecruiser was practically identical to her sister ship. I grant you there were differences in fine detail, as with all sister ships, but the practical function of the ship was identical to Moltke. The same designed 25.5 knots, though she could go a bit faster if needed. The same 10 28 centimeter 11 inch guns. The same 12 15 centimeter 5.9 inch and 12 88 millimeter secondaries. And the same 280 millimeter 11 inch belt. With a length of 186 meters, 612 feet, and a displacement of around 25,000 tons at full load, Goeben was rather larger than her direct British contemporaries, though admittedly smaller than the Lions. However, the full technical details can wait for Moltke's video, as this video is going to be more focused on Goeben's long and fascinating service career, for which the raw armor, firepower, size, and speed figures are quite sufficient. The details about boilers or stuff like that can wait for Moltke, which will cover the class as a whole. That being said, sit down and grab a snack because this is going to be a long one. Beginning said long video, Goeben spent very little of her life in German waters. Laid down on August 28, 1909, and launched on March 28th of 1911, Goeben would fit out and commission by July 2nd, 1912. From there, she moved into sea trials, which all ships have to do, though there was an interruption in August and September of 1912 to join in maneuvers of the High Seas Fleet. The sea trials would, from there, complete in October of 1912, which is where, in normal circumstances, she would have joined her sister and von der Tann in the High Seas Fleet. Her service career would be anything but normal, though. With the Balkans entering one of its periodic stages of everything is on fire and everyone is dying, the German government decided they needed more visible force in the Mediterranean to support the Ottoman Empire, which was already at this point a valuable economic and military partner. At the time, the German forces in the Mediterranean amounted to a station ship, an antique unprotected cruiser, not even a protected cruiser, and two nearly as old training cruisers. That's not an insubstantial force for a nation that has absolutely no land in the Mediterranean, but it was certainly not projecting German power either. In light of this, the Germans formed a proper Mediterranean squadron and sent the freshly commissioned Goeben, alongside the equally new light cruiser Breslau, down south. This would be the last time that either ship would see German waters. Upon arrival, these two ships would remain the core members of the Mediterranean Squadron all the way through 1914. Occasionally, other cruisers would join, but they would soon enough leave to other assignments. As for Goeben herself, well, she spent most of her time showing the flag, as it were, visiting various ports across the Mediterranean for most of 1913 and some of 1914. That's a pretty boring duty, honestly, but also an important one then as it is now. Nothing quite shows, hey, my government is interested in this area, quite like a capital ship pulling up into port. Regardless, as there is little to really talk about in this period of service, we will jump ahead a bit to 1914. In the spring, Goeben and Breslau would spend time escorting the Imperial yacht around for a few weeks. This is the most exciting thing they had done in their service in the area, which is probably telling. Even so, when that was done, it went back to routine until a certain Archduke came down with a fatal case of lead poisoning. With the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the commander of the Mediterranean squadron, one Admiral Suchan, I think, ordered Goeben to Italian waters for desperately needed refits to her power plant. The ship, by this point, had worn out her boilers after 2 years of relatively hard service. Who knew? All those port visits took a bit of a toll on her boilers. And she needed thousands, that's not an exaggeration, thousands of leaky boiler tubes replaced. Ideally, the plan had been to replace Goeben with her sister Moltke, so she could sail back to Germany and see proper repair and refit. With the unfortunate death of the Archduke, this was not feasible anymore. Suchan, I really hope I'm not butchering his name here, saw the way the metaphorical wind was blowing, and decided to jump up the chain a bit and get the boiler tubes sent to Italy, as he sent his ship to Italian ports for ad hoc repairs. With most of her boiler tubes replaced in this process, Goeben and Breslau would sail towards Sicily to meet up with a German steamer for various supplies as well as to stock up on coal. With mobilization underway in Germany, this became ever more important. Becoming trapped in potentially hostile waters, Italy was seen as a fair-weather ally at best, was not exactly a desirable situation. With this in mind, the ships coaled and supplied quickly before setting sail again. This time towards France, as standing orders were that Goeben would bombard French targets and hunt convoys between France and North Africa. When the formal declaration of war came, Suchan would take his ships and bombard the French port of Philippeville in North Africa. This was done with over 30 shells before the two ships pulled back towards Italy once more, with French return fire proving, let's say, distinctly unimpressive. It was during this return to Sicily that Britain gave the ultimatum to Germany to withdraw from Belgium or face war. With it rather blindingly obvious that Germany would not do so, the appearance of two British battlecruisers was probably not viewed very fondly by the Germans. After passing each other, the British ships moved to shadow Goeben and her light cruiser consort, though they did keep a respectful distance in light of the formal lack of war. Joined by the light cruiser Dublin, the British kept up this chase for most of the day. This prompted the Germans to push Goeben to her limits, putting her entire crew on watch and sailing at a steady 24 knots, which, while definitely not the ship's theoretical limit, was certainly pushing her hastily refit boilers hard, especially maintaining the speed for so long that her stokers were collapsing from exhaustion. Some of those refit boiler tubes burst, which scalded and killed some of her crew, even. By the time Goeben reached Messina once more, she had all of 600 tons of coal left in her bunkers. Her maximum war load, for reference, 3,100 tons. With Italy very firmly neutral in the war, though clearly leaning more towards the Entente due to long-standing disputes with Austria, Goeben and Breslau would coal up and take on other supplies rapidly before sailing for Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire. This was done so desperately that the Germans, unable to properly resupply in Messina, would tear up the decking of merchant ships to directly transfer their coal to Goeben. The British had, of course, during this process declared war on Germany, and attempting to operate against French North Africa was, if not suicidal, then certainly very dangerous, as was staying in either Italy or Austria, doomed to being trapped in the Adriatic. There was some admitted discussion of trying to break out into the Atlantic, presumably to either raid shipping or return to Germany. In any event, and regardless of what the ultimate goal was, this was not pursued. Arguably a good thing. Sailing past Gibraltar, assuming one wasn't ambushed by either Entente fleet in the Mediterranean, was not exactly a great plan. Getting into the North Sea into Germany would have been, if anything, even more difficult because, the Grand Fleet was in the way. In any event, the ships sailed to Constantinople. During this process, the German ships would be shadowed once more by another British light cruiser, as well as a group of 4 armored cruisers, though these ships were older than Goeben. Smaller, lighter armed, and nowhere near as heavily armored, and actually slower than even Goeben's slowed by damage speed. All of these combined to mean that Goeben could fairly easily dictate any engagement to her advantage, barring a very lucky ambush on the British side. And even if they had pulled that off, the armored cruiser's guns might not even be able to do appreciable damage to Goeben, considering just how thick her armor is. Between this and lack of fuel for the accompanying destroyers that could actually damage the battlecruiser, it actually isn't hard to understand why the admiral in command of the armored cruiser squadron chose to decline engaging the Germans. He wasn't aware, after all, that Goeben had little enough coal to properly engage and still make port. With the British backing off, Goeben would stop long enough to coal up again, before sailing to the Dardanelles and into Constantinople. It was here, in a confluence of events well beyond the control of any one person, that the ships were formally transferred to the Ottoman Empire. Breslau became, apologies to any Turkish viewers, Midilli? I think it's Midilli. And Goeben became Yavuz Sultan Selim, or Selim. This ceremony was something of a formal smokescreen, however, for all that the ships hoisted new flags and took on new names. Sushan remained in command. Indeed, he became the commander-in-chief of the entire Ottoman Navy. And the German ships retained their German crews with the somewhat hilarious disguise, quote, end quote, of wearing fezzes because all Turks wear fezzes, right? Now, they also wore Ottoman Empire uniforms, but that's a bit less amusing than the idea of German sailors just putting fezzes on to pretend they're Turks. Anyway, that amusing side note aside, this was actually not necessarily intended to draw Turkey into the war, at least not at first. The Ottomans were pretty heavily divided on joining the war, and a gift of 2 modern warships was, while appreciated, not enough to force the issue. Even acknowledging that the Ottomans were, pretty rightfully, let's be honest, incredibly incensed by Churchill's unilateral decision to seize 2 of their battleships under construction in the UK. Angry or not, they were still not going to war over it. As such, Yavuz, as I will call her to avoid butchering her full name, spent most of October finishing the desperately needed boiler refit, while the Ottoman government debated on how to treat the war. With Russian disasters in East Prussia, the temptation to jump on the weakening Russian bear must have been very intense, though. This is admittedly where things get a bit foggy in my experience. I've seen this story told multiple ways, with the only firm fact of the matter being Yavuz entered the Black Sea on October 27th with the rest of the Ottoman fleet. After that, things become interesting in the best sense of the word, I suppose. After entering the Black Sea, Goeben would sail to Sevastopol, and on a foggy morning, she would bombard the port on October 29th. She would take 3 hits in return, scare off some torpedo boats, sink a mine layer, and capture a steamer before returning to the Ottoman Empire. All of that is very factual. Where it gets a bit more problematic is how much was Sushan acting on his own initiative as opposed to orders. There's 2 main arguments here. He either did it entirely on his own initiative as commander of the Ottoman Navy, fed up with the delay on entering the war, and intent on forcing the issue. He bombarded Russia in a clear act of aggression to force the Ottoman government to either join the war or disown their fancy new battlecruiser. The alternative is that Enver Pasha, you will know him very well if you study Ottoman history, ordered our German friend to do so, in spite of lack of a formal declaration of war, with the same goal, admittedly, of forcing the empire into a war it hadn't entirely decided it wanted. The fog of war aside here, a third option is that Enver Pasha did order Sushan to sea, and the German admiral went beyond his orders in bombarding Sevastopol. I've read multiple different sources, and none of them quite agree exactly who made the choice in the end. But I suppose it doesn't really matter beyond assigning blame on long dead men anyway. If you can find firm evidence here, I would love to see it. If only because I've read multiple sources and none of them quite agree on what happened. Regardless, the end result would be the Ottoman Empire declaring formal war on November 1st, whereupon Yavuz begins a long and interesting career of dueling with the Russian Black Sea Fleet. On November 17th, for example, the Russians decided they wanted to bombard the Turkish coast to pay them back for what they did. Sushan promptly took Yavuz out to chase them down. The next day, Yavuz ran into no fewer than 5 Russian battleships. A long-range gunnery duel ensued, with the Russians scoring first blood by landing a shell directly through one of her 15-centimeter casemates. That gun was understandably out of action, though Yavuz's return fire would land multiple hits upon the Russian flagship. These were not crippling blows, but a 6-inch gun was put out of action, and splinter damage was admittedly pretty heavy. At that point, Yavuz turned away and continued firing with her rear turrets, but no more hits were registered on either side. After this, the rest of 1914 would prove rather uneventful for the GK, until the very end of the year. The day after Christmas, in fact. December 26, 1914 would see Yavuz strike 2 mines, which is going to become something of a running theme. The first mine tore a hole in her side, though this damage was relatively minor. The torpedo bulkhead was admittedly buckled, but still intact. Within 2 minutes, though, she struck another mine. This one did a bit more damage, though again her torpedo bulkhead remained intact, if pretty heavily dented. 600 tons of water entered the ship in all before she made it back to the Bosporus and safety. This is probably a good point to say that, as a general rule, the Germans put a lot of stock and work in the torpedo bulkhead of their Grosse Kreuzers. This would often do its job, even in lack of any other defenses like torpedo bulges. The damage done actually matched almost identically to that of trials testing the protection before the war. That aside, this damage was, even if not at all fatal, difficult to repair. In fact, it would never be fully repaired, but we'll get into that later. In a sign of how unprepared the Ottomans were for a ship the size of Goeben, there was actually no dry dock in the Empire big enough to take Yavuz. Makes one wonder what they were planning on doing with those battleships the British seized, but I digress. They had to build 2 cofferdams in order to plate over the damage, and while that was being done, Yavuz would still have to sail a few times in spite of her damage, as she still remained the most powerful asset in the Ottoman fleet, even with 2 gaping big holes in her side. Rather telling what the state of the Ottoman Navy was, I suppose. The most notable of these sorties was probably on January 27th, 1915. Yavuz set out to rescue 2 Ottoman cruisers, one of which was her old consort Breslau, from Russia. As it turned out, though, both cruisers would arrive safely in Ottoman waters, and Yavuz would return to port without actually having to fight the Russians. Come February, she would begin repairs. These would last until April for one of her mine holes. Upon completion of those repairs, she would return to an operational tempo best described as sortie when the Russians did, exchange a bit of long-range fire, and break off. The Russians were playing a bit coy, and the Turks with their German crews were a bit wary of damage. Understandable, as Yavuz was still awaiting repairs on the second mine hole. It wouldn't be until May that the second hole was repaired, or, as I do air quotes you cannot see, repaired, because they didn't really fix it very well. They actually used concrete in lieu of proper steel, which is admittedly not unique to Turkey, as the Germans would use concrete patches on some of the worst Jutland damage on their GKs, and the British would use concrete on warspite come World War II. The point remains, though, if you're using concrete to repair holes on a ship, it's because you don't have the ability to fix it properly. Following those questionable repairs, Yavuz would have a rather uneventful career for a bit. Immediately after being repaired, she would sortie against the Russians again, as they were bombarding the Dardanelles in support of the Gallipoli landings. This would see the GK once again face off against multiple Russian battleships, though this time she took 2 hits. One punched through her deck and caused some minor damage to fittings and the like, buckling hull plates, so on and so forth. The other was a near miss that buckled hull plates on her side and damaged one of her 15cm casemates. This damage did not take long to repair, though 2 of her 15cm guns were removed to be used as shore defenses during this period. After this, she would sortie a few times in defense of other ships or to counter Russian moves, but the Ottoman government had realized that Yavuz was as much a propaganda tool as a useful warship. Risking her sinking was a bit ill-advised in regards to Ottoman morale, as well as the ability to prevent the Entente fleets from trying to force the Dardanelles. It wouldn't be until 1916, January 7th to be specific, that another really exciting moment occurred. On that day, chasing 2 Russian destroyers at her best speed, Yavuz was drawn towards the brand new Russian dreadnought. Oh god, this is going to be terrible. Forgive me, anyone who speaks Russian. Imperatistia Ekaterina Velikaya. So with butchering the Russian language out of the way now, this Russian battleship with a name I'm not even going to try and pronounce again, and the German-Turkish Große Kreuzer would trade long-range fire, though understandably Yavuz did not try to properly duel the Russian, upon realizing that the Russian ship outranged and outgunned her. Yavuz's captain turned away and made best speed to retreat. However, Yavuz had problems with her shafts and a dirty hull, which slowed her to the point that she was only marginally faster than the Russian, which could go 21 knots, showing how bad Yavuz was limping along here. Yavuz failed to hit the Russian, but the Russian also failed to hit her with anything more substantial than splinter damage. This continues the running theme of the Turks and Germans being unable and unwilling to risk Yavuz against superior forces. A funny side note before we move on, though. Yavuz encountered a German seaplane that they had to hoist aboard the ship. This is the middle of World War I, well before seaplanes on capital ships is a very common thing. They had no crane or aircraft handling facilities for this. So how did this crew do it? By being enterprising geniuses and using one of her turrets. They literally lowered one of her guns, wrapped ropes around it, and used that to hoist the plane aboard. So just imagine this image of this battlecruiser sailing along. A seaplane shows up beside it. The crew decides they're going to lower one of her guns, wrap the plane around it, and use that to lift it up. Smart, but man, that must have been terrifying for the pilot. That side note aside, Yavuz would return to the same pattern of escort missions, troll the Russians, sail around a bit, for honestly most of the rest of the war. All of 1916 and all of 1917, barring time being refit. It wouldn't be until 1918 that she would see real combat again. If it does feel like I'm skipping a lot here, I kind of am, but this video is already longer than the German GK videos, and would be even longer if I just went over and Yavuz escorted this convoy around, or and Yavuz avoided Russian battleships while helping out lighter Ottoman forces. Interesting stuff to read about. Would make this video probably an hour long. Anyway, entering 1918, we get the final Battle of Yavuz. On January 20th, Yavuz and Middelly set out against British bombardment forces. Calling it a battle, though, is perhaps stretching things. Monitors, which is what they were up against, as a general rule at this point, had heavy guns and about nothing else going for them. They were less warships and more barges with massive guns strapped on. Against a GK, wasn't even a contest. Yavuz, and a handful of salvos for each ship sank 2 British monitors in a matter of minutes, HMS Raglan and HMS M28 being the 2 in question. However, it would also be the last battle for Yavuz, and very much the last battle for Italy. The cruiser, still known as Breslau by her crew, would hit a mine after the monitors were dispatched. That crippled her steering, which is enough of an issue on its own, but not necessarily deadly, as Yavuz could still tow her. She was right there. But both ships promptly realized they were in the middle of a massive minefield, and they could see all these mines surrounding them. In ordinary circumstances, that would make it somewhat reasonably easy to dodge them. But again, Italy could not steer herself. Yavuz had to tow her. And in trying to set up a tow line, Yavuz struck a mine. 5 minutes after that, Italy struck 2 more mines. And then, because things can always get worse, in another 5 minutes, she would strike a 4th and 5th mine. Italy, Breslau, whatever you choose to call her, was doomed by that. 5 mines would sink a battleship, if they hit well. A relatively small light cruiser? No, Italy was never going to survive that many hits. She sank very rapidly. Yavuz, for her part, had no choice but to pull away as British ships approached, leaving behind the survivors of her long-standing companion to be picked up by the British. Even with that, Yavuz would also strike another mine, bringing the total to 3, as she had struck one prior to engaging the monitors. Yavuz would also run aground, attempting to return to the Bosporus. Facing constant bombardment by Allied aircraft, and a monitor joining in on occasion, the GK would only be towed off that sandbank after 6 days by another ex-German ship, though an antique battleship this time. Returning to dock, Yavuz would only see minor repairs. The holes wouldn't even properly be patched, not even when she was in dry dock and captured Sevastopol. With the end of the war rapidly approaching, Yavuz would see no more real combat. Formally handed over with her German crew departing after the Ottomans exited the war, she would remain tied up in dock until the 1920s. By this point, the Ottoman dynasty was long gone, and the name Yavuz was no longer a shortened version of her full name, but what the ship was formally named. In 1927, a French company would refit Yavuz, though this mostly consisted of finally fixing that old mine damage. Remember what I said earlier? It took a very long time. And the actual refit? That was mostly just improving her power plant and fire control. She didn't have her armor protection improved at all, and her anti-aircraft defenses remained questionable at best. Still, at the end of this process, brought on mostly by Greek naval construction, Yavuz would come out fully repaired for the first time since she entered Ottoman service. At this point, she was certainly small and outdated, but she was also still the most powerful combatant in the Aegean or Black Sea, which speaks mostly to the state of the Greek and Soviet navies, more so than how powerful Yavuz was. Regardless, she was still the flagship and pride of the Turkish fleet, and it was there that she would serve, off and on, until 1950. In this process, she would become the longest-serving dreadnought-type ship in any navy, as well as the rare case of a World War I capital ship sending in formation with an Iowa-class battleship, when Missouri visited Istanbul. After her decommissioning, Yavuz was offered to the West German government as a museum ship in the 1960s, though this was declined, which is a shame if you ask me, considering all the history in this ship. With that not happening, Yavuz would linger on in Turkey until being scrapped in 1973. In the process, becoming the last of the battle cruisers, as well as the last Imperial German ship. Not just capital ship, ship period. Through it all, Yavuz remained an interesting ship. The last of the GKs to survive, the one that probably saw the most missions, even if most were boring, of any of them, even as she continued to sail with barely patched mine damage. Sure, I'll admit, She didn't see a Jutland equivalent. But her duels with the Russians, the sinking of those monitors, her entire post-war career as the pride of the Turkish fleet. Here's a ship that served for 40 years, that lasted 60 years, and was the last of her breed. She deserves to be remembered better than, oh, that battlecruiser the Turks had. With this lengthy video done, thank you for watching, if you stuck around. I hope to see you in the next one, and please like and subscribe. See you in the next one.